It was a busy morning at Prime Trust Bank, the atmosphere buzzing with the rhythmic clicks of keyboards, the hum of printers, and the hurried conversations of customers making their transactions. The bright LED lights cast reflections on the polished floor, illuminating the bustling scene. In a quiet corner of the room, David, an elderly veteran, sat hunched over, his trembling hands clutching a stack of old paperwork. His weathered face and silver hair spoke volumes of a life full of challenges. He was trying to withdraw money from his account, the last of his savings, to save his wife, who was fighting a terminal cancer diagnosis. However, as he handed the paperwork to the cashier, the young woman shook her head sympathetically, informing him that his account no longer matched the new electronic banking system. She told him he needed to update his documents before he could make any withdrawals, but David had no time to spare. His wife's condition was rapidly worsening, and this was the only resource he had left. The cold response from the bank teller only deepened his sense of helplessness. David's desperate voice broke the silence. "Please, I need this money. It's all I have left." His voice cracked as he pleaded, but the cashier, her face blank, reiterated the bank's policy. The surrounding customers, some of whom overheard the exchange, began to whisper among themselves, but none were bold enough to step forward. They knew what was happening was wrong, but no one was willing to speak up. Just then, the door to the bank opened, and a man in a simple gray t-shirt, jeans, and a red baseball cap with the slogan, "Make America Great Again," stepped in. Few recognized him immediately, but this was none other than Elon Musk, though dressed casually. As he walked past the rows of desks, his sharp eyes immediately caught sight of David sitting alone, clutching the papers. Musk approached him quietly, his gaze softening. "Hello there," Elon said, his voice calm and reassuring. "It seems like you're having some trouble. Can I help you with something?" David looked up, his voice weak and filled with despair. "I don't think anyone can help me. They're refusing to let me withdraw money to save my wife. This is all I have left." Elon's eyes narrowed slightly as he scanned the scene. A flicker of frustration crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll make sure we get this sorted out." With that, Elon turned and called for the bank manager. Moments later, the bank manager, Evelyn, entered the room with an air of confidence and authority. In her early 40s, she was sharply dressed in a tailored business suit, her demeanor one of someone used to controlling the room. When she saw Elon standing with David, her face hardened and her eyes quickly scanned the situation. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Musk?" she asked, her voice betraying just a hint of disdain. Elon didn't flinch. He met her gaze directly, his tone firm but composed. "Yes, there is a problem. Your bank is refusing to help this man withdraw money to save his wife. You're turning away someone in need because of an outdated policy." Evelyn's lips pressed together in a tight smile, her posture unwavering. "Our systems are in place for a reason. If his paperwork is not up to date, we cannot process the withdrawal," she replied dismissively, as though the matter was already settled. Elon raised an eyebrow, his voice growing more pointed. "I don't think you understand. It's not about the paperwork. It's about a human being in a crisis. His wife is dying, and he needs that money to try and save her. There's nothing more important than that." Evelyn's expression remained icy. "If you're not satisfied with our procedures, Mr. Musk, I'm afraid there's nothing more to discuss. Please ask Mr. David to leave if he's unwilling to comply." Elon's eyes flashed with irritation, but he didn't back down. "I'm not asking anyone to leave. What I'm asking for is compassion. You have the power to make an exception, and you should. This is about a life, not a policy." Evelyn took a moment, her gaze flicking to the security guard standing by. Her calmness shifted, but she quickly masked her unease with a cold and final tone. "If you're going to insist on this, I'll have to ask you to leave. We don't tolerate disruptions in this bank." David, now completely deflated, lowered his head, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "No one cares. No one ever cares," he whispered to himself. Elon heard this and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Don't give up," he said softly. "We'll figure this out." Elon stood tall, looking at the guards and Evelyn one last time before turning to leave. But before he could step out the door, he paused and added, "I'll be back, and when I return, things will be different." The next day, Elon Musk returned to Prime Trust Bank, but this time he was not the casually dressed figure he had been before. Instead, he wore a sharp black suit and carried himself with an air of undeniable authority. The moment he stepped inside, he was the center of attention. People whispered in awe, recognizing him immediately, and even Evelyn, the bank manager, couldn't hide her surprise. When Evelyn saw him, she knew instantly that this was not the same man who had walked in the day before. Her confident demeanor cracked slightly as she tried to mask her discomfort. Her pulse quickened and a knot tightened in her stomach. Elon walked up to the front desk, and without hesitation, he asked to speak with Evelyn. She arrived shortly, her composure slightly frayed from the previous day's events. "Mr. Musk," she greeted him, trying to regain her cool. "What brings you back here today?" Elon gave her a tight-lipped smile. "You know why I'm here. I haven't forgotten, and I don't think you have either. The issue yesterday wasn't resolved, but today it will be." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean? Yesterday, we were clear about the rules." Elon's eyes narrowed, his voice calm but assertive. "The rules don't matter when human lives are at stake. You're refusing to help someone in need, and I'm not going to let that happen again." Without warning, he pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase and handed them to Evelyn. "You'll want to read this." Evelyn took the papers, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through them. As she read, her face drained of color. The documents revealed that Elon Musk had purchased a significant portion of Prime Trust Bank. He was now its largest shareholder. "I don't think you understand," Elon continued, his voice now cold. "This bank is mine now, and I don't run my businesses by treating people like they're disposable. I expect better from everyone here, starting with you." Evelyn stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. She had no idea how to respond. For the first time, her position of power felt fragile. "I'll make sure the system is updated to accommodate people in need. No more excuses. Mr. David's withdrawal will be processed immediately, and I'll be overseeing everything personally from now on." Elon added firmly. As he walked away, leaving a stunned Evelyn behind, David looked up, his eyes wide in disbelief. "You did it. You really did it," he whispered in awe. Elon smiled, turning back briefly to meet his gaze. "No one should have to fight this hard for a little help. Now let's go save your wife." David sat in the small waiting area outside the bank manager's office, his hands trembling as he clutched the paperwork that had been handed back to him. He had never thought he would see the day when his life would take such an unexpected turn. Only the day before, he had been on the brink of losing everything: his wife, his home, and his dignity. But now, thanks to Elon Musk's intervention, he had hope again. As David waited, he could hear the hushed whispers of the bank employees as they gathered around the front counter. There was a palpable shift in the air, a realization that something momentous had just occurred, something beyond their usual day-to-day routine. But David, lost in his thoughts, barely registered the conversations. His mind was consumed with the image of his wife, lying in a hospital bed, pale and weak from the ravages of her illness. Suddenly, the door to the manager's office opened, and Elon Musk stepped out, his face calm but resolute. He motioned for David to follow him, and the two of them walked together toward the teller's desk, where the cashier who had initially refused to help David was now standing with a flustered expression. "Elon, thank you," David said in a low, grateful voice. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Elon smiled but waved off the gratitude. "You don't owe me anything. This is about doing what's right." The cashier, her eyes wide with shock, hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Musk, I didn't realize who you were when you first came in. I didn't think anyone would interfere with our protocols." Elon raised a hand to silence her, his gaze intense. "The only protocol that matters here is compassion. We're all human, and it's time we start treating each other that way." The cashier, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, nodded and immediately processed the withdrawal for David. The transaction went smoothly, and within moments, David held the cash he so desperately needed in his hands. His heart raced with relief, but the urgency of the situation still loomed over him. "Take care of your wife," Elon said softly, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "You've got a second chance, and I hope you use it well." David could only nod in gratitude as he hurried out of the bank, and clutching the money tightly. As he stepped into the crisp afternoon air, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter. "Dad, we need to talk. The doctors are saying Mom doesn't have much time left." David's heart sank, but he knew that now, at least, he had a fighting chance to save her. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the pressure. The money he had just withdrawn was his only hope now. It was all he had to give his wife, the woman who had been his rock for over 40 years, who had stood by him through thick and thin. Her health had deteriorated rapidly in the past few months, and the doctors had given up, saying that there was nothing more they could do. But David refused to give up. Not now, not when he had a shot at saving her. When he arrived at the hospital, he rushed through the sterile hallways, his heart pounding in his chest. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly as he approached the intensive care unit. He was met by the nurse at the door, who gave him a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, sir, but visiting hours are over," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. "I need to see my wife," David said, his voice shaky but filled with urgency. "I have something that can help her. Please, I need you to let me in." The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." As she opened the door to the ICU, David entered the dimly lit room where his wife lay, frail and connected to various machines. Her face was pale, her hair thin and sparse, but there was still a spark of recognition in her eyes when she saw him. Her lips parted to speak, but no words came out. "Shh," David whispered, kneeling beside her. "I'm here, love. I've got it. The money we need. We're going to fight this, I promise." Tears welled up in her eyes as she weakly grasped his hand. She wanted to say something, but the strength to speak had left her. David kissed her hand gently, his heart breaking as he watched her struggle to stay awake. But he had no time to waste. He needed to find the right doctor, the one who could administer the experimental treatment that might save her life. And with the money he had, he could afford it. He called the number on a pamphlet he had found at the hospital, a line for a controversial new treatment being offered to terminal cancer patients. The person on the other end of the line was hesitant, but agreed to meet him later that evening. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. "Don't give up on me," David whispered to his wife as he stood up. "I'm not giving up on you. We'll fight this together." That evening, David met with the specialist, Dr. Richard Larkin, in a dimly lit cafe near the hospital. Dr. Larkin was a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a weary, worn-out expression. He had a reputation for working with experimental treatments, but they were often controversial and not widely accepted in the medical community. When David sat down across from him, he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This was a dangerous gamble, an untested treatment that had worked for some, but failed for many others. He could see the hesitation in Dr. Larkin's eyes as he looked over David's wife's medical records. "This treatment," Dr. Larkin began, choosing his words carefully, "it's not without risks. It's not guaranteed to work, and there are side effects we don't fully understand yet." David looked him in the eye, desperation clear in his voice. "I don't care about the risks. I just need a chance. My wife doesn't have much time left." The doctor nodded slowly, then glanced at the medical papers again. "I understand, but you should know this is a 1 in a million shot. If she doesn't respond to the treatment, it could make things worse. It's a tough choice to make, and I can't guarantee anything." David took a deep breath. He knew the risks. He knew that failure would mean losing her forever, but he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. "I don't care what it takes," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just give her that chance." Dr. Larkin leaned back in his chair, staring at David for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "All right, I'll prepare the treatment, but you'll need to make arrangements fast. We need to act before her condition deteriorates further." David nodded, a surge of relief flooding him. This was his chance, his last hope, and he was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. The hours following his meeting with Dr. Larkin were a blur for David. The weight of the decision pressed down on him more with every passing moment. He couldn't shake the thought of what would happen if the treatment failed. The risks were astronomical, and the potential consequences were dire. Yet, As he sat beside his wife in the sterile hospital room, her breathing shallow and labored, there was no other choice. He reached out and gently stroked her hand. Her skin was cold, her once vibrant face now pallid, but her eyes flickered open when she sensed his presence. She managed a faint smile, her lips trembling slightly as she squeezed his hand in return. "I've arranged the treatment," David whispered softly, though his voice cracked with emotion. "It's not guaranteed, but I have to try, for you." Her eyes held a silent question, as if asking whether he truly believed in the treatment's success or if he was simply desperate. David could only offer a tearful smile in return. He couldn't lie to her. He didn't know whether it would work. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to give up on her. As the day drew to a close, David gathered the necessary funds from the bank and prepared for the procedure. He had taken the necessary steps to ensure that every requirement for the experimental treatment would be met, and Dr. Larkin had promised to act swiftly. He tried to keep his mind focused, to push away the gnawing fear and doubt that threatened to overwhelm him. By the time evening fell, David stood beside his wife once more. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the machines monitoring her vitals. He felt a surge of love for her, a deep, raw affection that surpassed the fear and uncertainty. She was still fighting, even if she couldn't physically fight anymore. He would be her strength now. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just a little longer. I'm going to bring you back to me." The experimental treatment began late that night. David paced the sterile hallway outside the ICU, his mind reeling with questions and doubts. Dr. Larkin had assured him that they would do everything possible to minimize the risks, but the procedure was still uncharted territory. The treatment involved a combination of unproven drugs as well as cutting-edge techniques that had yet to be fully tested. David's heart was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: hope, fear, and exhaustion. He had always been a man of logic, someone who had lived his life with a careful, methodical approach. But now, standing on the edge of the unknown, he felt as if everything was slipping away. The life he had built with his wife, the future they had dreamed of, all hinged on this fragile moment. Hours passed, and the silence of the hospital seemed to deepen. His phone buzzed intermittently, but he ignored it. He couldn't bring himself to focus on anything other than his wife. Every minute felt like an eternity. Then, finally, Dr. Larkin emerged from the ICU, his face a mixture of exhaustion and guarded optimism. David stood up immediately, his breath catching in his throat as he stepped forward. "How is she?" David asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Larkin ran a hand through his hair and sighed deeply. "It's too early to tell. We've administered the treatment, but it's going to take some time for her body to react to it. There could be side effects, and we won't know if it's working until we see the results. But there's a chance." David felt a fleeting moment of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He clung to it with everything inside him, knowing that the battle was far from over. "Thank you," David said, his voice breaking. I don't know what I'd do without you." Larkin offered a tired smile. "You're not alone in this, David. We'll do everything we can." David nodded, and without another word, he returned to his wife's room. Her face remained unchanged, her fragile form still hooked up to machines that beeped softly. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his once again, and waited. Hours passed, but there was no change. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. His eyes began to close, his body sinking into the uncomfortable chair beside her bed. But just as he was about to drift off, he felt it, a small, steady warmth radiating from her hand. David blinked and looked down. Her fingers, once cold and lifeless, now felt warm against his skin. His heart leapt. He leaned closer, watching her chest rise and fall in a steadier rhythm than before. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but stronger than it had been in days. Tears sprang to David's eyes, and he gripped her hand tightly. "You're awake? You're really awake." A faint smile played at the corners of her lips. "I knew. You wouldn't give up on me." David kissed her forehead, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. For the first time in months, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, the treatment was working. It wasn't a miracle, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new. Something worth fighting for. The days that followed were a delicate dance of cautious optimism and overwhelming anxiety. David refused to leave his wife's side, not wanting to miss a moment of her recovery. Her condition gradually improved, but the doctors were quick to caution him that the road ahead would still be long and uncertain. Her body, weak from months of illness and the grueling treatment, required time to heal. But with each passing day, her strength seemed to return. Her color improved, her breathing became less labored, and the cloud of hopelessness that had hung over their lives began to lift, ever so slightly. David never let himself believe it was all over. He knew better than to get his hopes up too high, especially with something as unpredictable as experimental treatment. But he couldn't deny the changes he was witnessing. She was getting better. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. One evening, after the doctors had completed their rounds, David took his wife's hand and kissed it gently. "I'll never stop fighting for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Her eyes, now brighter than before, locked onto his, and she whispered back, "I'll fight too. For you. For us." David smiled through his tears. No matter what the future held, they had been given a second chance. And for that, he would be forever grateful. Days turned into weeks, and the steady improvement continued. His wife was able to sit up in bed for longer periods, and eventually, she was able to speak without strain. The doctors remained cautious, but their faces had softened. David could see the hope in their eyes as well, something that had been absent since her diagnosis. And though there were still many hurdles ahead, David had learned something invaluable through this ordeal. That even in the darkest moments, there was always a sliver of light. Sometimes, it just took time to find it. Every night as he sat beside her bed, he repeated the same words, "I'll never stop fighting for you." It had become a promise, one that neither of them would break. Together, they were stronger than any illness that could threaten to tear them apart. It was a crisp morning when David stood at the threshold of the hospital room, his eyes taking in the quiet, peaceful scene before him. His wife, still fragile but undeniably stronger, sat by the window, her face bathed in the soft light of dawn. The once ashen hue of her skin had returned to a healthy glow, and though the weight of her illness lingered in her gaze, there was a spark there, a spark that had been missing for far too long. For the first time in months, David felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, not because the fight was over, but because they had fought it together, and they had won. "Are you ready to go home?" David's voice broke the silence, rich with emotion. It was a question he had asked many times before, but today it felt different, almost sacred. She turned to him, her lips curling into a soft, tired smile. "Home," she repeated, the word tasting foreign but sweet on her tongue. "I never thought I'd hear you say that again." David walked over to her, kneeling at her side. He gently took her hand, his fingers brushing over the delicate skin that had once been so cold to his touch. "I know it's been hard," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "But we're here now, and whatever comes next, we face it together." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she squeezed his hand. "I was so afraid, David. Afraid I wouldn't make it. Afraid I'd never see you again. Never feel this normal again." Her words trembled, and he leaned in, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "You're not alone," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "You've never been alone." There was no grand moment, no miracle cure that would make their lives return to the way they once were. But as she slowly stood, supported by his steady arm, it was clear. They had both changed. And with those changes, a new chapter began. As they walked through the hospital doors, the sun breaking through the clouds overhead, it felt as though the world itself was waking up with them. The shadows of the past still loomed. There would be more battles to fight, more scars to heal. But there was also hope now, hope that hadn't existed before. A quiet, unspoken promise that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. David looked at his wife, her gaze steady and sure as she looked forward. They had come so far, and though they both knew the road ahead would be long, they were ready to walk it together. With every step, they left behind the fear and uncertainty, embracing the possibility of tomorrow. In that moment, the weight of the world felt a little lighter, the future a little brighter. And as they walked out of the hospital, hand in hand, they knew the most important thing. They had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. Their love, once tested beyond measure, had emerged stronger, resilient, undying. And in that, they found their new beginning. As the sun began to set on Prime Trust Bank, its golden rays illuminating the building, a quiet transformation had already taken place within. The once cold, impersonal institution had now become a symbol of hope, humanity, and the power of change. It wasn't just a financial institution anymore. It had become a place where people mattered. Elon Musk stood outside, looking up at the building with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had come to this place with a vision, to create a space where compassion could thrive alongside policy. To him, it was never just about profit or efficiency. It was about putting people first. As he glanced at the bustling staff inside, attending to customers with genuine care, Elon knew that the seeds of change had been planted. The reforms he had set in motion were not just about rules and regulations. They were about rewriting the very fabric of how businesses, especially banks, should operate. This was just the beginning. David, standing beside him, had witnessed it all. The transformation of a man's heart, the evolution of a system, and the kindling of hope in a place that once seemed devoid of it. With the money he had withdrawn from the bank, David had been able to secure his wife's treatment. But more than that, he had received a lesson in humanity, in compassion, and in standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. David smiled at Elon, the deep lines of weariness on his face softening. "You didn't just change a bank, Elon," he said quietly. "You changed my life. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left." Elon met his gaze with sincerity. "You're the one who inspired change, Mr. David. It's people like you that remind us all of what's truly important." And in that moment, as the stars began to twinkle overhead, they both understood. The true measure of a person's success isn't how much wealth they accumulate or how high they rise in the ranks. It's how they touch the lives of others, how they stand up for what is right, and how they leave a legacy of compassion in a world that often feels cold. As the night settled in, Prime Trust Bank became a beacon of that legacy. A place where veterans, the elderly, and anyone in need could find not just financial support, but the assurance that their humanity would always be respected. This story wasn't just about a bank, a veteran, or even Elon Musk. It was about a shared belief that compassion should always lead the way, no matter the system. It was a reminder that no matter how small the act, it has the power to ignite change, spark hope, and ultimately transform lives. And so, the journey continued, one act of kindness at a time, creating a ripple effect that would last far beyond the walls of Prime Trust Bank. The story didn't end there, because real change never does. It lives on in the hearts of those who dare to care. Thank you so much for staying with us and listening to this entire story. We hope it touched your heart as much as it did ours. Every story has the power to change lives, and we believe that through compassion and empathy, we can create a world where people are treated with the kindness they deserve. If this story inspired you or made you think about the difference one person can make, please consider giving us a like and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more stories that aim to inspire, uplift, and remind us all of the power of compassion. Thank you for your support, and we look forward to sharing more incredible stories with you. Stay tuned, and remember, small acts of kindness can change the world.